Oh, here we go. I need water. Why are we tardy?
Sorry, I was in band.
Doesn't look like you're a man. Look like you're robbing a cow. How many milk do you get? You take other people's milk?
No.
You got a milk extortion ring going?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Wow, that escalated quickly. All I wanted was a cut. Now, no. Great albums of all time. On this day in 1974. Okay, I'm on the run. Come on, computer. All right, so let's do a couple notes about revolutions. We had the Industrial Revolution. Let's get to revolutions of the 20s and 30s, starting with the Congress of Vienna, which are hoping to avoid all the regulations. Did I say regulations or revolutions? So we have the Industrial Revolution and other revolutions. My plan is, so today and tomorrow, revolutions, 19.2 due tomorrow. Maybe a quiz. Maybe you want a quiz tomorrow on 19.2? Maybe. I'm going to say 19.3. We are going to watch Day Universe Chain 7. And we do have to have a time for some art. We need some romantic art. And so, a couple things in really quick. First off, there are a bunch of new ideas came out of the French Revolution. And also the Industrial Revolution, they go hand in hand. We got the French Revolution blowing this idea that people have certain rights. Yeah, they kind of came out of the Enlightenment, but here's the new Europe after the French Revolution. So number one is liberalism. And liberalism comes directly from liberty. Liberty. And the idea of liberty in this is a self-sufficient, so you know, this idea would be like a small farmer who own your own land, you decide your own fate, you're self-sufficient. Now, this is a very important concept because this is obviously pre-industrial revolution. So maybe you're somebody, an artisan working at your cottage industry, because they wouldn't call it then, that then. In American history, Thomas Jefferson had this vision of small independent farmers covering the countryside. Independent on their own. Now, this totally, or this is it, not totally. This is before the Industrial Revolution and all the changes that are coming out about this, about workers and the wage system. And so it's really hard to put that into context. And also, everybody has natural rights. And so liberalism, an idea, will reform to have people having rights. Remember John Locke's rights: life, liberty, and property. In the Declaration of Independence, one of the first great liberal documents that would at least help form a country, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these liberal documents, now they didn't want like a revolution per se, as a violent revolution. Those who wanted liberalism did not want another French Revolution. This they thought they could do a kind of a peaceful reform or a peaceful revolution, depending on your point of view. And that's supposed to say Locke. That's what's going here from John Locke. Next, a constitution. They believed in a constitutional law where the laws are listed out. Britain would do the first real constitution, even though, remember, we've talked about that before. That was the Bill of Rights and a few other things. It was a list of documents, starting with the Magna Carta back in 1215. But they wanted a constitution where laws are written out, and the best form of government that liberals believed that would protect rights would be a republic. Now, they weren't all Democrats. When I mean Democrats, I'm talking small d Democrats, meaning they didn't necessarily want a great voice for the people. it would be a republic where maybe just an oligarchy where a few of the elite would decide their leaders. And most of these liberal reformers would do that, including a country called the United States. That was going to be just a few make the decisions. I mean, to this day, the people do not elect the president. To this day. And the Supreme Court is appointed, which is a massive part of the American governmental system. They're not elected at all. And so that exists here still. I'm not making a value judgment on that. So you have to get the notes because you can't see. No monocle.
Just listening.
And this market economy, Adam Smith and the invisible hand, with the idea being people acting in their own interest. Now, the problem with this would be, this is still pre-capitalism, and only a few people can afford the machine and everything else. But it's individual choices. So government should be there to protect individual choices and protect rights, but let them make the decisions. So it's very anti-mercantilism. And so classical liberalism is really pre-industrialization, pre-capitalism, with the idea that government has hands off and letting people make their own economic, political, and social decisions. Industrial Revolution will blow it. And so one of the first leaders of this movement are going to be the first capitalists, who say, leave me alone and let me make money. And then as soon as they start making money, then they wanted this to go away. Then I want to keep my money.
What's the thing that's right next to choice? What's that thing?
Individual choice.
Okay.
Yeah. Individual choice. And so a classic example of this would be Jeffrey Benson down the road. This liberal idea of utilitarianism.
You mean Jeremy?
What did I say?
You said Jeffrey.
Jeffrey?
Yeah.
His brother Jeffrey was best known, Jeremy Bentham. And this is his picture. That's his. It's his wax. It's his wax figure at the British Library, and his idea would be of liberalism. Society must be the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. I'll explain this picture in just a second.
Look like he's sitting in a closet.
It kind of is.
It's like an elevator.
Pre-elevator, but we're getting close to that. Elevators are coming at the end of this century. Actually, they had elevators before. The problem with the elevators is stopping them. Yeah, that what made elevators work was a brake. It's actually, you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Because going down can be problematic if you don't have a good braking system. But his big thing is in this idea of liberalism, a lot will be experts. And the beginnings of, you could see it coming of specialization. People who specialize in societies and how societies function, like sociologists or government political scientists, or how people deal with scarce resources, aka economics. It's coming. Now, the original, when they first made this, he was actually sitting and underneath was his mummified head. But they decided that they didn't want his mummified head anymore, so they removed the head. I know, I'm with you. That would have been awesome to have the mummified head there.
Wait, was it like his actual
Yes,
head?
his actual head was, it was underneath, he was like right between the
So
eyes
his
because,
actual head was looking at a wax,
where else would you put it?
I don't know.
You gotta check my will. Moving on.
Oh, God.
Ooh.
Where in Vienna?
That's it.
Where is his wax supposed to be sitting in? What fruit is that?
I don't know what it's supposed to be, but yeah, that is really one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, but that was his real head.
Why is his head like that? Why is
Where else would you put his head?
In a
In
box?
the ground?
So, John Stuart Mill is another example of this. And Mill would write on liberty. And he was a classic kind of term about liberalism. And the liberty of the individual and protection from the majority. And you see a lot of this in the U.S. Constitution had a lot about the protection of the majority. So this was not a new idea. And Mill would have monumental fights with conservatives. He would coin the phrase, I'm not saying that all conservatives are stupid, but all the conservatives I know are stupid.
Was he also sitting in a closet with
No.
his head on the ground?
Now, he would not necessarily agree with people who might call themselves liberal in the United States, but classical liberalism economically is actually what we would call in the United States more conservative economics. And so, for example, Democratic presidents who have been conservative economically your whole lifetime have been called neoconservatives. Bill Clinton, you weren't alive, but Barack Obama was a neoliberal, conservative economic. Biden was, but Biden has changed. Kind of interesting, he's changing when he's like, what is he, 79 now?
Something like that.
Kind of amazing. Yes, it is actually really amazing. We'll very good chance we'll have another rematch between one man in his early 80s and one man in his late 70s running for president. I know what you're thinking. That's younger than me, and you're close.
You're like 3,000 years old. You were here in the Roman era.
Another big thing that come out of the French Revolution was naturalism or nationalism. We've talked about nationalism, but it really didn't exist till the French Revolution. You can see elements of it in history, little bits and pieces of it, but most of the time, no one held this unity or this idea that my cultural ethnic group should have self-government. France was just France. Britain was Britain, yet England was England, yet they fought 100 years war to get parts of what is now France. And so this is a relatively new thing that came out of the French Revolution. But you see elements in the American Revolution, just little bits. But it came out of the French Revolution. And this idea that we should have self-government for our cultural group. It could be by language, it could be by common history, tradition, something to unify people. Language is usually the biggest one. When we think of France, we think of the country of the French. There's going to be a fight for who dominate the German language. Will it be Prussia or Austria? It will be Prussia. Eventually they'll create Germany. And the groups within Austria, like the Czechs, will want their own country, etc. You see it right now in the Catalonians around Barcelona are at this moment, once again, talking about independence. So a country around Barcelona, or the Basque here. And you see it, the big thing about nationalism, you see it starting in the French Revolution and rippling across Europe. And so, for example, where there's a war right now, Ukraine, 1850s, 1860s, you start seeing Ukrainian nationalism. It's going to take a while to get there.
Yeah, it starts in that valley.
In that valley, yes. By the way, is that sun up or sun down? And then once you do have a country, it's intense pride in your country. Now, this was seen as a very liberal idea at first, and then it would go the opposite way. And so here are people fighting for Belgian nationalism. Yes?
Did they have much nationalism during like the Middle Ages?
Not at all. The concept would have made no sense at all. Basically, for most people, it was what strong man is stealing from me now. What feudal lord do I owe money to?
So it's not like I'm fighting for France because I'm fighting for the king.
For the most part, you see elements like in the 100 Years' War, there'll be bits of this. And then some of the 30 Years' War, little elements, but for the most part, no. That is a new thing. The idea is I'm fighting for my country. The French Revolution really got that, a little bit in the American Revolution. 20th century nationalism would become the dominant. We definitely, it's such a massive unifying or disunifying factor. Yeah.
Color of the things they're wearing. Because to me it looks black. Just all.
I think it's supposed to mean that just the mass of people, so they can't differentiate the colors.
It's difficult to paint each individual clothes.
So you're going to start getting these revolutionary movements for independent countries within these empires. You see it everywhere from Greece to Poland, all the way across Europe, wanting independence or self-government. And when that also meant an implication that we will decide our own fate, not some king. And you'll start seeing in the 20th century, far-right dictators begin to use this. Not always far-right, but we'll see it after World War I. Italian nationalism and anger, bitterness over the war, disillusionment over The results of World War I would lead to fascism. The same disillusionment would lead to Nazism in Germany. The same kind of thing would lead to fascism after the fall of the Soviet Empire and high expectations that weren't met in places like Hungary or Poland today, as fascism is on the rise. And very certainly Russia. After the Soviet Union fell, the thought was, there really was a thought there'd be like this explosion of free enterprise and capitalism. What turned out instead, just a few very wealthy people took over, and their leader, the shirtless fascist right here. He's not really a fascist, he's more just an authoritarian. Also, out of the French Revolution will become modern conservatism. Now, when someone calls themselves conservative today or liberal today, those words are so messed up. I don't even like using the terms anymore.
The definition has been changed.
To now it's almost meaningless. It's like a team. I'm on this team or not this team. And it's silliness. For the most part. And so what is 19th century conservatism? And that is going to be a reaction to the liberalism, starting with the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, etc. This idea of rights. And so conservatism will come out of this. Conservatism has always been a reaction. There'll be movements of liberal thought, more rights for certain people, and then a conservative backlash, a reaction. That's why a lot of times you see conservative movements called as reactionary, even though that's not quite what it is. But you see it called that. So more rights for people, backlash to take it away. You see the same thing with rights for women, then a backlash to say, no, women have too many rights. And it's usually to restore the old hierarchy. Started running out of time last year in my AP US history class, but that's when I really want to fit it. In the 1970s, you saw that here. The backlash against civil rights and women's rights in the United States that have come to dominate society. And that's why they're all going to be pro-monarchy. But this idea that there should be certain people on top. Yes?
When it says historical hierarchy, does that mean just like the king, or does that also include nobility?
Yeah, the nobility, the king, and you'll see it down the road for other people who feel they should be on top and might lose power. So when business leaders begin to become monopolists, they want to keep that power. So they would become conservative. Not all, but most. And who support, obviously, the ruling class. And also there's going to be a big peasant for conservatism. Even though they're the ones who have always been cheated by the ruling class and the nobility because of feudalism and being serfs, they fear the urban nature of this liberalism, of this change. There's always, in every society, a liberal and urban divide. But we definitely see it here. We live in Helena, so that's a huge city. So think how much different it is other places. But you know what I'm talking about. You go to Billings, that's a big city. And it's scary. So that's, we have that fear of urban. In the United States, there is a definite urban and rural divide. And since rural areas are kind of overrepresented in our government, it's really a big deal now. And the most famous would be Edmund Burke, who would write his Reflections of the French Revolution, basically saying that, sure, there might be some parts for rights, but there are certain people who should be on top, and therefore technically above the law. There's Burke talking. Burke is the father of conservatism today. Very much a reaction against revolution and equal rights. Did I put this down? Nope, I didn't. And so, what do we have these characteristics? Dependent, inherited, that's supposed to be positions. Provide. That's probably when I'm typing and talking to somebody. So I was redoing this fourth period yesterday. I only had one student in my class. And I was talking to him and doing that. He has a certain sophomore. Because everyone was taking the ACT test. So I was talking to him and I go, let me type this real fast. So I had to finish this up and I meant to type in inherited positions. I typed in provided, so I didn't catch it. That's supposed to be positions.
Let's go ahead and change it right now.
I don't want to. So, dependent inherited positions. So people have got to know their place. At the end of the 20th century, make sure you get this down. That is 20th century. So even though you're not writing, guys, That is social Darwinism, the most dominant philosophy in the world today. And they provided stability, and the idea of everybody's fighting for individual rights will lead to chaos. You know, I was just talking about fascism in another class, and fascism really pushed this idea: if we're not all together as one people, individuals fighting for rights, strong people will come in and divide us and break up our nation. So individual rights, and that's the Congress of Vienna. So the state should be supreme. And that is where you start getting nationalism. It started as a liberal reform, becoming conservative. You can't put yourself ahead of the state. How dare you fight for rights? We must all be together for this, under a ruler who should be providing on top. And so democracy is the worst case. That either equals a dictatorship or weakness. How's it a dictatorship? If you have democracy.
Happened to Russia. Don't they claim that elections were too good every time?
And technically, he took power in their democratic republic way. And you get a strong man who will sway the people, because most people, they vote, what are they? According to this concept, if you allow everyone to have a vote, most people are what? Weak and malleable, and stronger people will persuade them. Or everybody will be fighting for who will be in power, and stronger countries will dominate. Democracy equals weakness. So that's when you see people who when they get to the extremes of conservatism, they might be saying, you know, elections should not matter. Elections are not important. Elections make us weak. Things like term limits are really bad. And so that is a romantic idea. Now we'll talk a little bit more about romantics when I talk about romantic art, because we gotta talk about romantic art. But a romantic idea is this concept of the world is changing too fast, and we've got to go back to when life was better, aka the good old days. So you're going to see when the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution hit, a lot of people say we should go back to medieval Europe. That's when life was good. And so here is an example of the Romantic era. There's Burke fighting against these changes of people acting like the leadership or religion, but disguising who they really are.
What is that supposed to be?
It's supposed to be some creature representing change, somebody to be feared, but it's disguising itself.
Oh, it looks like it has a really long nose.
And you can see a lot of romantic art showing like this individual looking over an era, or medieval places where people knew their place. We didn't have all this change. Now, romantic does not mean romantic love. Romantic means a desire for a better time when life was good. In the 20th century, we see this as a desire to go back to the golden age, when our country was great and not weak like now. And so, to go back to the way things should have been. So Burke would be saying, we can't have the French Revolution. We should go back where we know kings were kings and people knew their place. Now, let's be clear. There are a lot of bad things, so we can't have everything. We should go back to kind of like it was in 1767. So with that, here's Europe in 1812. Where were you?
I was at a medical conference thing.
A what?
Medical conference thing. I was presenting like a movie I made last summer.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, so here's Europe in 1812. And so that is the end of Napoleon's reign, the invasion of Russia. Here's the Confederation around the Holy Roman Empire is gone, a rump state of Prussia. For a short time, an independent Prussia called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, or Poland. Yeah.
Why exactly did the Holy Roman Empire fall?
Napoleon felt that there's no reason to have all those different states without power, and Austria was dominant. So that would weaken Austria.
Okay.
And so with that, the Congress of Vienna would be instituted of all the great powers who defeated Napoleon to come together, and here represents all the great powers of Europe, and you see the funny one, the rump state of Prussia.
Wait,
That's actually kind of a good analogy, because Prussia will grow. and become strong, and then become the king of Prussia, will become the German emperor. So we can blame Prussia for everything. So that, you don't need to know all these people now. These are all the people who met. Alexander, Frederick of Prussia, Talleyrand, the great survivor of France, Casserole, who spoke for the British, but there's one person we need. The person who was the host of the whole thing, Prince Clemens von, just simply write down Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. And he, in many ways, would dictate the conservatism of the early 19th century, the post-Napoleon 19th century, Metternich. Metternich's going to be around for a very long time. In fact, he might still be there if we quick get there. And so Metternich, with this idea of all of Europe coming together for collective security, and go back to the status quo. What does that mean? Go back to the way it was before the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, and by definition, this is conservative. Here is another one, and I had to put this up, of the four great powers, and you see there's the French under the table, and that one isn't Prussia. That one, it kind of looks vaguely like Napoleon, doesn't it? I wasn't sure if that's Prussia or Napoleon, but I couldn't read it. I just thought, close enough, another baby, you know. So with that,
Wait, is that like the French supposed to be defeated underneath?
Yeah. The new French monarch. So France is going to be occupied, and they're going to have to pay an indemnity, reparations. 700 million francs, or the value of 700 million francs in gold francs. So France is going to have to pay, this will be known as reparations a little bit later on, for all that they put Europe through. The old borders will return, and there'll be a new French king. The Bourbon monarchy will go back, nearing the end of it, but Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, would come back.
What happened to the 17th?
That was Louis XVI's son, who died in captivity during the French Revolution. And the thought was, we'll go back to the way it was, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle. All these ideas are drumming up of nationalism and liberalism, conservatism, and it'll be back and forth for the rest of the, well, till now. And don't forget, the Industrial Revolution is happening. So the whole world is changing. This is such a dynamic time. As dynamic as the time is now, and maybe we'll have that, which I'm a little worried about. We might be that dynamic right now. And I think, ooh, that could be kind of scary. We've had nothing that compared to this in my lifetime, and certainly not yours. I'm older than you.
We know that. You're a teacher.
So with that, what changes were made? So here's the basic one. Oh, don't write all these down. I put all these down to just give you an idea. The whole map of Europe is going to be changed. And I thought, you don't need to know every one of these. But Poland would be kind of independent, but under the rule of Russia. Prussia would grow. And they'd also take a big hunk of Poland. So just watch the rest of this. There'd be a German confederation. The Confederation of the Rhine, the Holy Roman Empire, is gone. But Austria is part of it. Another thing, Austria is going to expand. Get all this land in blue. So Austria will expand into that. So you get the point. Everyone's getting their spoils. We're all going to get something out of this. Norway and Sweden became one. That would be for the next 100 years. Yeah.
So how does it work with all?
Like where?
I mean, the German Confederation.
So that's where you get the Austrian Empire had this weird thing where we had the Germanic parts in the empire and the non-Germanic Slavic and Hungarian parts outside. Yeah, it's really weird. Eventually, that would break up into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They would have to get dual monarchy. Yeah.
When you say Norway and Sweden were, what does that mean? They became one country?
Mm-hmm.
What were they called?
Huh?
What was the?
Well, you see it called there in Sweden as Norway, but everybody called it Sweden. And Norway would eventually break away from their own country, going into the 20th century. Switzerland would ever be neutral. Now, what does that mean? Nothing. Belgium would also be guaranteed the neutrality. And of course, Germany's going to break it in 1914 and 1939 or 1940 for fun. But Sweden could, or Switzerland could remain neutrality, not because anyone called it neutral. Why? Mountains. It's too difficult to invade. That's the only reason to remain neutral. And Sweden would fight in war after war, and they would become neutral. What's interesting, though, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sweden now looks like they're going to join NATO. Boy, did the Russian invasion backfire for them. Britain expanded. They are going to permanently get this colony called Cape Colony. You might have heard of South Africa. Something's coming there. We're going to briefly talk about something called the Boer War. And Sardinia was given the Piedmont. Sardinia got bigger. I wonder what the Sardinia will become. The king of Sardinia will become the king of Italy. Guess what we're having next week?
What?
I will be eating pizza in front of you.
What about us?
Huh?
What
You get to watch me.
Lasagna.
Huh?
You should eat lasagna instead.
Lasagna has nothing to do with the Italian. Pizza comes from
Pasta.
Pizza comes from Italian unification. So, to keep the peace, Russia pushed for what's called the Quadruple Alliance. And that would be 4 conservative kingdoms. But Britain wanted nothing to do with it. So Britain basically bailed out.
So this is a triple alliance, not a quadruple.
So the original was going to be these 4. But eventually, when Britain bailed out, they would dub it again with Metternich's approach as the Holy Alliance, implying that conservatism was brought by God. And this will be a norm that will come from this, that liberalism was godless. Yeah.
Could the name Holy Alliance also be?
Oh, that word came, but that was partially for the Trinity. Yeah, that's actually a good analogy. Now, they really fit the idea that the rest were godless when I wrote the Godless French Revolution. But yeah, that's a really good point. The Trinity, very good.
Who's that underneath the map? At the bottom?
That's France.
They love putting France underneath the table.
Yeah, they lost. So with that, so let's get to one revolutionary movement. We'll finish this tomorrow. How many revolutions are we going to have? Lots.
More than one.
And Britain almost had it, but those Methodists came. That's another story. Yeah, Methodists probably kept Britain from having a revolution. It's one of those wild stories of history. So, all these circles are areas where there's going to be revolution. All of them.
Wow, not in Germany?
Oh no, we got Germany too. I didn't put. So, first off, there's going to be revolutionary movements in the Balkans. Countries in the Balkan Peninsula that were under the Ottoman Empire are going to begin to break away and form independent countries. So, for example, the Danubian on the Danube River principalities would eventually, Wallachia and Moldavia, would eventually form an independent country. What country would that become? Anybody know what country is right there?
Hungary?
Romania. Romania is coming. And then also Greece, the beginnings of Serbia. Bosnia would also fight Macedonia, but the biggie would be in Greece. And Greece would capture the popular imagination because this was just at a time where, first off, the classics were there. So they still wanted this classic education, but the Romantic era was beginning to look back. And they loved the idea of the Greek culture and civilization breaking away from the decadent Ottoman Empire. Thus, the Greek Revolution. And this one will be a popular revolution, partially based upon Greek ethnic group, the Greek language, and also a little bit of a revolution with the Greek Orthodox Church, which the vast majority of Russians were Greek Orthodox, so Russia would be on their side. Now, this is a little bit misleading. The old Byzantine Empire that would collapse finally in 1453, they all spoke Greek, and they were kind of Greek culture. They spoke Greece, I know.
Yeah,
They speak like Johnny Travolta.
This is the great artist Delacroix did a number of Napoleon. We saw one Napoleon crossing the Alps. And there is Greece on the ruins. That's one of where the big battles were in Greece fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And that woman that would be very classic in these romantic revolutionary art of Lady Liberty. Yes, that would come to the United States. Maybe the French will make a little statue for the United States having to deal with this. I don't know. It could be anything.
Oh yeah, it's pretty big, I think.
So the Ottoman Empire, ironically, had become the sick man in Europe. 200 years earlier, they were besieging Vienna, looked like they might conquer all of Central Europe. By this time, they were just barely hanging on, not for the different power play between the great powers of Europe, the different groups fighting each other. They would have probably collapsed in the 19th century. They actually did much better than anyone thought in World War I and would not collapse until 1918. But a concept called Pan-Hellenism. Now, those of you who are here first semester might remember the Hellenistic era of Greek culture that would start after Alexander the Great. So Pan-Hellenism became a sign for Greek nationalism, that those with Greek culture should form their own country. And they had the kind of romantic support. Wow, let's go back to this old style, Greek cultural art, civilization before all these radical changes of the revolution. So Britain, France, and Russia all supported, no one more than Russia. Now, I should be clear about this. I think you can see it on the map. Why did Russia support the Greeks?
To separate them from the Ottoman Empire?
As important as that might be, and that's important too, yes, they want here, but to weaken the Ottomans because they want this. The Russians don't have access to the sea. Yes. You weaken the Ottoman Empire. So the Greek Orthodox Church was important, but also could be used as an excuse.
Why is it Constantinople? Wouldn't it be Istanbul?
Now, even though by then the Ottoman Empire was calling to Istanbul there, in all diplomatic maneuvers the Ottoman Empire would do, everybody else in Europe, they still call it Constantinople.
When was it actually changed diplomatically?
Turkey.
Okay.
And a lot of countries would fight this. Oh yeah, we'll show you, we'll still call it Constantinople. You saw it when Persia became Iran.
Yeah.
And Britain made a big deal to humiliate Iran by calling it Persia. So, that's why they call today Persia. It's an insult to Iran.
So would that also be an insult to call Istanbul Constantinople?
Yeah, today it is. If you go there and say it should be Constantinople, yeah, that's a major insult. Same thing if you go to Prague, if you have a drink, don't toast. That's a major insult to Hungarians.
Wait, why?
That's what Austrian officers did. I found that out. So, okay, don't toast. We only have water. Okay, so that was actually really funny. And so, after a series of battles where all these romantic poets and people went to fight for the Greeks, the Russian fleet defeated an Ottoman fleet, and at the Treaty of Adrianople, Russia formally defeated the Ottomans, but the Ottomans kept Constantinople. Russia tried to get it, and what happened was Russia won. And they said, hey, we're going to take Constantinople. We want it, or we want around that. And who said, no, we don't want you to take Constantinople?
The Greeks?
The British and the French.
Oh.
They were allied at first, and no, we don't. Let's not get greedy. This will happen again. There'll be another war called the Crimean War, then the Russo-Turkish War, yeah.
What would have done different if they had
It's impossible to even imagine. Right now, we'd be speaking Bulgarian. Other than that, I know nothing else. And then in 1830, the Treaty of London, Greece became independent. And because it happened in London, and there's this kind of romantic movement in Britain, which makes sense for romantics to be there because of the Industrial Revolution, there's always been a close tie between Britain and Greece. And so one of the deals that Winston Churchill would make with Joseph Stalin in World War II would be basically, all right, Stalin, you can do whatever you want. Here, we want to maintain power in Greece. No, they did not tell the Americans. This will have issues down the road, I'm sure. Yes?
When it says romantic support, how exactly would they support them? Like financially or militarily?
Both. And so individuals would give money and the British government began to send. The big thing they said was the Royal Navy. Russia sent troops.
Okay.
And France actually sent some troops. But the big thing was basically the moral support and the Navy support, so the Ottomans couldn't get anywhere.
Okay.
So tomorrow we'll finish the rest of this. I'm going to give you the first 10 minutes of class tomorrow to finish up your reading the maps, and then we will do the quiz tomorrow. How many questions would you like?
52.
52. That's easy.
We need
It was only going to be 8, but
51. There it is.
31 with the bonus.
ooh, very good. That's a mystery.
What about 50 with 2 bonuses?
2 bonuses?
Yeah, 2 bonuses.
We're going to watch something on. No, I'm sorry. For the rest of the year, then, the special topics, Fox. We're just going to go out with Fox. Just one time to make it count. How many people could now do the map and pretty much not even have to look? Pretty much.
Like some
Yeah,
cities,
open
locations, like I know what this generally have, but like I don't know the pinpoint on this. Somewhat okay.
It's amazing how it works. You do a few maps, and next thing you know, it's just kind of there.
Sometimes we should have a blindfolded map label.
I
See who can
Blindfolded?
try.
Where's Germany? It's
Yeah.
over here.
Just
One of my best friends in graduate school is this guy who did his master's in art, and he was bored drawing, looking at it. So he was drawing. He basically draw by hand. Just really, he just so he would look and do it all. I said like this: we have a model and do it with charcoal and not look at it. That was much more artistic. And I'm thinking, I would do that, and it just would be like, why?
I could do the end look at it and still
And it would
like,
come, and it would be like, wow, that's cool. So that's what you guys got to do.
Okay.
have you seen those people that can draw both hands? That's
I could do that too.
This would look good.
Yeah, just, don't if you have the qualifier of doing it well.
Yeah.
Somewhere I got to find the art. He gave me one of his pictures, and they would have modeled. They just like this, and it was really cool. But he like do a face, and he look at you. It was like perfect. Some people are nice. You can do a lot of that, but he was. He's also crazy, but that's another story. I can't tell you some of the stuff. I will tell you though, this first time I ever watching him jet ski, he would just take the jet ski full speed and then just go into the water. Because you would kind of pop out, you kind of pop out and come flying. But what an artist. You know the reading? You got the reading, everyone got the bookmark. I think I'm gonna, let me look at the section 3. No, section 3. By the way, this is have you looked at the bookmark and seen how big a chapter this is? This goes for the Industrial Revolution, all the events of the early 20s, or of the early revolutionary period, then all the late revolutionary periods, all the way up to Tsar Alexander and emancipation, so we're talking like the 1890s. And then it has electricity and Darwinism and Beethoven and Frankenstein. We'll do a little Darwin. We'll do that in the day the universe changed. So we'll have a little basic test tomorrow. Next week,